Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into one of the toughest areas of criminal law, both morally and intellectually, the defense of necessity.
hmm
We're asking the question, when does breaking the law stop being a crime and, actually become the only right thing to do?
hmm
We're talking about that moment where you have to violate a statute because if you don't, something much, much worse is going to happen. Our sources today are a mix of legal treatises and some really famous cases.
Yeah, landmark cases.
Exactly. And our mission is to figure out where the law draws the line and why it's so reluctant to give people this justification, especially when lives are on the line.
And it's so important to frame this correctly for you, the listener. Necessity is what we call a justification defense. That means we're saying the defendant actually did the right thing, all things considered.
But it's not an excuse like insanity.
Not at all. It's not about lacking capacity. It's saying the action was morally correct. So, to really get this, we have to start with the general rule, then immediately pivot to its most famous exception, intentional homicide, and then see how the legislature can just take the whole defense off the table.
Okay, so let's start there. The general rule. What is the basic principle of necessity and how is it different from duress? They sound pretty similar.
They do. The general rule of necessity says that breaking a law is justified when following the law would have caused a demonstrably greater harm. It's pure public policy. The law is basically allowing you to pick the higher value at the expense of a lesser one.
Okay.
And traditionally, the big difference between necessity and duress was the source of the pressure. Necessity was all about physical forces of nature, storms, fires, starvation on a lifeboat.
Right.
Duress, on the other hand, is about pressure from other people, someone holding a gun to your head.
Nature versus man. Simple enough. But I've read that modern laws, like the Model Penal Code, kind of merge them into a single choice of evils defense. So does that distinction still matter?
It does, because of a really crucial technical point. Whatever the source of the pressure, it has to work on the defendant's mind. It has to lead to a willed, conscious choice.
What do you mean?
I mean, if a tornado picks me up and throws me through a storefront window, my defense isn't necessity. My defense is that I didn't commit a voluntary act at all. Necessity only kicks in when you consciously choose the lesser evil.
I see. Okay, so let's test the limits of that choice. This is all about balancing values, but the
Yeah.
law puts a hard stop on that when the value is a human life. We have to talk about the most famous case here, Regina v. Dudley and Stevens. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
This is the case everyone learns. You have a shipwreck, 4 men, 3 sailors, and a young cabin boy adrift in a tiny boat 1,000 miles from anywhere. After 19 days with almost no food or water, the boy is extremely weak, close to death. 2 of the men decide to kill him so the other 3 can survive by eating his body and drinking his blood. They're rescued 4 days later. And the evidence was pretty clear. If they hadn't done it, they all would have died.
That is just a gut-wrenching scenario.
Yeah.
So what was the core legal issue for the court?
The question was incredibly precise. Can the intentional killing of an innocent person, just to save your own life from starvation, ever be justified by the defense of necessity?
What rule of law did the court apply? Could you state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its elements for us?
Sure. The rule is crystal clear, and it's still the law in most common law jurisdictions. Necessity is unavailable as a defense to a charge of intentional homicide, full stop. And the court based this on two core policy elements.
Yep.
First, harm gravitas. The idea here is that homicide is the absolute worst harm, so the harm you avoid, saving your own life, can never be objectively greater than the harm you cause, which is taking another innocent life. 1 for 1 is not a lesser evil.
And second, social policy and self-sacrifice. The court worried that allowing this defense would basically encourage people to save themselves by sacrificing the weakest innocent person around instead of upholding a moral standard of self-sacrifice.
Wait, hold on. The court actually said 3 lives are not objectively greater than 1. That just flies in the face of, basic math and survival instinct. How did the court apply that first element, harm gravitas?
They flat out rejected that kind of utilitarian math. They said the law considers every innocent life to be of equal value, period. So killing the cabin boy to save 3 men wasn't choosing a lesser evil. In the eyes of the law, it was just choosing an equal evil, which is murder. So it failed that element right out of the gate.
And if the law demands that all lives are equal, what about that second element, the social policy piece? Were they really saying these men should have just laid down and died?
Yes.
Essentially, yes. The court said that the law has to set a high moral standard that people should strive for, and that standard sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. They argue that if the law were to approve of murder for self-preservation, it would, completely unravel the social order.
Wow. So after analyzing both of those elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The killing was ruled murder. It was not justified. And the big takeaway from this is that the value balancing and a necessity defense is objective. It's decided by the court based on society's values, not the defendant's desperate calculation. And when it comes to killing, the common law refuses to treat human lives like poker chips.
Okay, so the court rejected the math when a life is actively taken. But what happens when a life is already doomed? Let's test this no alternatives requirement with the famous mountaineer hypothetical. So imagine two climbers roped together. One slips and falls over a cliff. He's dangling. He can't be saved. He's doomed. The climber on top can't pull him up and is slowly being pulled off the edge himself. If he doesn't do something, they both die. So he cuts the rope.
Right. And this is such a powerful contrast to Dudley and Stevens.
Why?
Because it hits that key requirement. The defense only works if there was no open third alternative that would cause less harm. In this scenario, the dangling climber is going to die no matter what.
Ah, I see.
Cutting the rope doesn't sacrifice a savable life. It accelerates an inevitable death to prevent a second, completely avoidable death. So the law would see that as a justified choice of evils. You're saving the one life that actually can be saved.
That distinction is razor thin, but makes perfect sense. A savable life versus an unsavable one. Okay, let's mix in another element. Personal fault. What about a situation where someone who is drunk takes the wheel because the driver jumped out of a car stalled on railroad tracks? Or, say, someone is being brutally beaten and their only escape is to drive away while intoxicated.
Great examples. They test two things at once. First, imminence. In both cases, the threat, the train, or the beating is immediate. It's happening right now. So that requirement is met. But second, they test the no-fault element. The defendant was at fault for getting into the situation, at least partially, by choosing to become intoxicated.
And how does the law handle that? Does being at fault just kill the defense completely?
It depends on the jurisdiction. The old common law approach in many places would be to say, tough. You are reckless, you created the mess, you don't get the defense.
Harsh.
Very. But the model penal code is more nuanced. It might say, okay, the immediate choice to drive to escape death was necessary, but you're still on the hook for any crimes of recklessness that come from your original fault. So if you hit a pedestrian while driving drunk to escape, you could still be charged with reckless manslaughter, even if the driving itself was justified. Your initial fault doesn't bar the defense, but it sort of downgrades your liability.
Okay, so we've seen how courts balance values. But what happens when the legislature itself steps in? Can they just decide what the values are ahead of time and shut down the defense?
Absolutely. The necessity defense is sort of a gap filler. It's only available when the legislature hasn't already spoken on the issue. If a statute is clear that you can't do something even to save a life, then that's the end of it. The court can't overrule that.
Let's apply that to a case. I'm thinking of United States v. Oakland, Cannabis Buyers Cooperative. What are the legally dispositive facts here?
The cooperative was distributing marijuana, which is illegal under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. They argued it was a medical necessity for their patients, some of whom had conditions like glaucoma and were getting real documented medical benefit.
Then the core legal issue.
The issue was whether this idea of medical necessity could create an exception to a federal law where Congress had itself already made a judgment about the drug's medical value.
What rule of law did the court apply? Can you state the rule and its elements?
The rule is that necessity is unavailable if a legislative purpose to exclude the justification plainly appears, and it really just comes down to one element. Legislative exclusion. The court just has to ask, does the statute's language or history show that the legislature already weighed these competing harms and made a choice?
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. How did the court apply that first element, legislative exclusion?
The court looked right at the text of the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA. They pointed out that Congress created specific exemptions for other drugs that have accepted medical uses. But for marijuana, Congress put it in Schedule I, the strictest category, which is defined as having no accepted medical use.
So Congress had already done the balancing test.
Exactly. The court said Congress had already decided that the value of controlling marijuana outweighed any potential medical benefit. Allowing a necessity defense here would mean the court was just subbing its own judgment in for Congress's. And a court can't act like a mini legislature and amend the law.
And so, what was the court's final conclusion?
The defense failed completely. It's a powerful example of legislative supremacy. If the legislature has spoken clearly, the necessity defense is off the table.
We've covered a lot of the core doctrine, the homicide rule, these legislative limits. For the listener trying to put this all together, can you synthesize it into a step-by-step diagnostic checklist for analyzing a necessity problem?
Of course, if you're faced with a necessity issue, you have to run through this framework. Each step is a hurdle the defense has to clear. First, what's the source of pressure? A natural force pointing to traditional necessity or a human threat, which might be duress or a modern choice of evils analysis.
Okay.
Second, check for legislative intent. Has the legislature already foreclosed the defense like they did in the Controlled Substances Act? If yes, you stop there. Third, comparative harms. Was the harm avoided objectively greater than the harm done? And remember that big common law rule, one life is never greater than another, so homicide almost always fails this test. Fourth, intention. Did the defendant actually intend to avoid the greater harm? Just having a good outcome isn't enough. The motive matters. Fifth, no alternatives. Was there any other reasonable, legal way out of the situation? And this is where the mountaineer hypothetical is key. Was the life that was sacrificed already doomed anyway?
Right.
Sixth, imminence and duration. Was the threat immediate? And if it's an ongoing crime like escaping from prison, did the defendant stop the crime as soon as the necessity was over? And finally, seventh, no fault. Was the defendant to blame for creating the situation in the first place? And if so, does that bar the defense entirely or just reduce the charges they might face?
That framework really shows how narrow this defense is. The law is demanding that your choice isn't just about saving your own skin, but that it serves some greater objective public good.
Precisely. And this whole doctrine gets tested in that ultimate visceral hypothetical, the
Yeah.
ticking time bomb scenario.
Yes.
This scenario suggests that maybe torturing a terrorist suspect to find a bomb and save thousands of lives is justified. Why? Because the harm avoided, mass casualties, is so astronomically greater than the harm caused the injury to one person. The very fact that we debate this shows that necessity is this powerful, almost terrifying legal tool. It forces us as a society to ask, where are the absolute limits of our own rules? When the stakes get that high, does the rule of law just break? Or is necessity the final logical answer?
A profound question to think about. It really highlights that razor-thin line between a justified act and a criminal choice. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.